Hello Russell, I'm a Django developer since years now, and I've always listened your name or watched your talks in the Django ecosystem, so it's an honor for me to run this interview with you. So thank you for being here in PyCon Colombia.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's I do speak at a lot of conferences around the world, and it's an honor that anybody wants to listen to this little Australian speak on anything. So thank you for the invitation.
Okay. First of all, I want to start by some basics. Like, can you tell us who is Russel Kid Magee? Maybe some of your background. What do you like? What don't you like?
So yeah, I'm an Australian, obviously from Perth, the Wajak Noongar country. I'm born and bred in Perth. My undergraduate studies were all in physics. My father, when I was looking to what I was going to do in university, my father's advice was that computing is ultimately a tool, and you need to learn how to do something, and then you can use computing to do that thing. And so my undergraduate studies were in physics, and I moved over into computer science for my postgraduate work. I am passionate about building tools that people use. I like to see people use the things that I do, and that's partly why working with Django in particular was so invigorating. You know, here is something that I am building in a little tiny part of the world, isolated away from everyone, and it's now used on every continent on the planet. It's used to start new businesses. It's used to give people opportunities to get out of bad economic situations. There's one case I've seen where it's used for malaria prevention in Africa, and knowing that little thing that I've done has grown, or that I've contributed to, has grown into such a huge thing is incredibly validating, and a really sort of good experience.
Okay. I know that getting your PhD was a very challenging thing for your life, right? Now that you've done it, do you think that if somebody like me who maybe wants to be like a world-class developer or like a top-level developer, if I want to be there, do you think I need to get one PhD for me?
No, or at least not necessarily. On reflection, I did a PhD for the wrong reason. I was always at the top of my class going through my undergraduate studies, through my high school and undergraduate studies, and I ultimately did a PhD because that's the thing you do after you do your honours degree, which on reflection is the wrong reason to do a PhD. My PhD was a very hard fought process, mostly because my internal motivation wasn't aligned with what it was we were trying to do. About halfway through my PhD program, my supervisor, who is a very dear friend to this very day, Sveta Venkatesh, is an amazing woman. She pulled me aside and we had a very frank conversation in which we both agreed that my future did not lie in academia. And that really is telling from where I've ended up, is that what I wanted to do was write software, get things out in the world, very much the practical hands-on side of things, rather than the theoretical side that a PhD program generally kind of encourages. Maybe there might have been a way of making my PhD slightly more practical or slightly more applicable, but the PhD program that I did was not aligned that way. There are many people that I know who are successful in software who have not done a PhD. There are people that I have mentored who are literally high school dropouts or have not done university degrees at all, and they can be very talented developers. So it depends very much about what you're trying to get out of the experience. A PhD can be a very useful experience, and I certainly did learn lots of very useful skills through doing a PhD program. But there would have been other ways to develop those skills that might have been a better use of my time in that particular instance. So yeah, my experience is not a good model for people doing PhDs.
Okay, so Django.
Yes.
We're currently Django version 2.1-ish. Since which version did you start working and contributing to Django, and which were your main contributions to the framework?
Sure. Okay, so I can't track the exact date, but my first time I downloaded Django and played around with Django would have been around November of 2005, which I think puts it around either 0.90 or 0.91. So Django as a framework was open. It was an internal closed source project for several years, was open sourced in July of 2005, and I found it about 4 or 5 months later. So that was my first experience with Django, using it as a user at that point. At that point, it was a very, very young, very, very new project, and there was a lot of things it didn't do. And I had an idea about what I wanted to build a website to do. I was trying to learn web technologies, and I had tried Ruby on Rails and I tried PHP, and they just didn't gel. I didn't get what they were trying to do or how it worked, or how the web worked, despite having a PhD in computer science. And Django clicked for the combination of the documentation and Python being readable. It made sense all of a sudden, like that fundamental thing of it made sense. And so when I discovered that Django didn't do some things that I wanted, I said, okay, well, I can do Python. Let's see if I can help here. Open source, you're supposed to contribute. Let's contribute. And the very first thing that I contributed is something that Django these days you consider to be absolutely second nature. If you have a pair of models with a many-to-many relationship, you have model A that defines a relationship to model B. You used to be able to query model A and get all the model Bs that are related, but you couldn't query from model B all the model As that it was related to. So I fixed that. That was the first thing that I added. Now that's how Django works. That's what you do. But it wasn't when I joined the project. So that was my first really big contribution, and that was probably one of the major triggers that led to me being invited to join as a contributor around would have been January of 2006. From there, at that point, we were in the middle of this big process called magic removal. It was a big internal restructuring of the code base, and a lot of my contributions were around managing the magic removal process. That wasn't one specific thing, it was just that was the big effort, the big drive that took about 6 months. After that, the biggest feature that I landed was Django's testing framework. Django itself had a test framework, but you couldn't use that test framework to test your own Django applications. And so I landed a bunch of changes that exposed Django's testing tooling as something that you could use on your own projects. I was also involved with the multiple database support. Alex Gaynor did the heavy lifting of that work was done by Alex Gaynor as a Google Summer of Code project, which I mentored him through that, and then I sort of followed up at the end of the Summer of Code project. I helped polish that code up so it was ready to be committed into the code base. So that was another big contribution. And interestingly, one of the last big features that I landed was the aggregations framework in the query language. So the ability to say, get me the count of all of the users who do something, or the average price of the objects in the database, which was actually one of the things that I wanted to do when I very first started. My first contribution was the many-to-many code. But my motivation going into that, the project that I wanted to work on, involved taking averages or average ratings of something that I was working on, and you couldn't do that in Django without some extra handling. And the reason I got involved was because I wanted to be able to do averages. And about 5 years after I started contributing, look, you can now do averages. So that was a very long process to get there.
You did the aggregation thing with one of your students.
That was another Summer of Code project. So yeah, it was Nicholas Lara did the design work was was a paired activity. He did most of the bulk of the implementation, and again, I polished the final product so it could be committed to the Django code base.
Usually, we as developers start contributing to open source projects with small or maybe unpopular projects. Mm-hmm. What piece of advice could you give to us to successfully contribute to a big project like Django, and maybe manage ourselves to become like a very valuable member for the project itself, like you did?
Sure. Well, firstly, I have to point out that when I joined Django, it was a small and unpopular project. So, my advice I certainly now have perspective from having been involved in Django for a long time, but my experience was not joining a large and successful project. I was joining the small and unsuccessful project, and I just happened to have lucked out and picked a good one. But regardless of whether you're joining a small project or a large one, the advice is mostly the same. Reputation is something that is built over time. When you want to contribute, it is easy. Like writing one patch is easy enough. Like you can write code, you can write one patch. But reputation as someone who knows how this thing works, of how to push an idea, of that you understand what the project is trying to do, is not something that is obvious in one patch. It is something that comes after your 10th patch, after your 15th patch, after you've been engaged with the community and talking to people. So when you're trying to engage with a community, be it a small one or a large one, established project, new project, whatever, you need to build that reputation over time. You can't start, your first contribution can't be huge, it can't be world-changing, it can't be completely unexpected and unusual. It needs to be small and controlled so that the rest of the community gets to know who you are. And then you can maybe do something a little bigger and a little bit bigger. You may going into the project have this big idea, like I wanted to get aggregations into Django's query language, but that, well, I actually did try in the early days, and my proposals were basically largely ignored. It wasn't until I had been with the project for a long time that I had the reputation and people understood who I was and understood where I was coming from, understood my design sensibilities and engineering skills before that large proposal was something that was going to gain any traction in the project as a whole. So essentially the advice there is essentially you have to be persistent. You have to not just commit one patch and expect the world will change. It's one patch and another patch and another patch. And over that time you build a reputation. People know what to expect from you and are more willing to engage with you. If someone is going to spend time reviewing your patch, that is an investment of their time in you. Why are you worth me investing time in you? If you are someone that I know, if you are someone that has a reputation, if you are someone that I know has hung around the community for 6 months or whatever, and has a history of contributing meaningful, well thought out, sensible patches, then I'm much more likely to want to engage with you and to develop this new idea than if you are a completely random person who may have exactly the same set of skills, but I don't know you have that set of skills. I don't know who you are. You need to build that reputation over time.
Okay, thank you. So patience is clue.
Patience is key, yeah. So you can't, there is a quote that I'm very fond of by a German philosopher named Max Weber. It says, politics is the slow boring of hard boards. Nothing complicated or hard is ever easy to achieve. You need to be persistent, you need to keep trying, you need to do little things over and over again. If you want to achieve a large thing, you need to do lots of little things to get there. So yeah, be persistent, don't expect to change the world in one pull request if it's going to be your first pull request.
Some years ago, I say a lot of years ago, you were the maintainer of a project called Django Evolution,
yes,
which was like the built-in migration system we have nowadays in Django. And the migrations nowadays are pretty solid, right? They are very stable and very comfortable to work with.
Yes.
Is the migration system what you expected it to be, or do you have something that you will change from this?
No, I mean what Andrew Godwin landed with what was South, and then what landed is the migrations framework in Django is actually quite similar to what was in Evolution, in Django Evolution. There were some minor differences, but they were mostly minor differences. The reason there was more than one was essentially just a matter of focus. Django Evolution was one of the first frameworks for managing database migrations in the Django ecosystem as a whole. I think I was on stage at the very first Django Con in 2008 with both Andrew and Simon Willison, and we were basically the representatives of the three projects that were doing migrations in any form. My code had been out for a while. Andrew had I don't know if he had open sourced. It was only just recently been open sourced, and Simon's was mostly just an internal project that he threw some code out to get it to work. So there were differences, and there was the code that I wrote was very, very young and not especially mature. I persisted with that project, but just didn't quite get the traction that I was hoping, and I didn't have a deeply compelling need myself to continue it. I was basically doing it because I thought this was something the Django community, Django as an ecosystem, needed. I didn't necessarily need myself. Migrations are useful, but it wasn't something that I had a pressing need to do this on my engineering projects at the time. Andrew Godwin, on the other hand, he did have that motivation to keep going, and that was sort of his way of engaging with the Django community. He was the maintainer of South a long time before he joined the Django project as a core team member. I was looking at the rest of Django as well as maintaining evolution. Andrew was just maintaining South, but that was his focus. And so what we ended up with a fully mature and developed version of South that turned into Django migrations as the thing that's in the core. There was a lot of similarity and a lot of overlap with how the two projects were sort of developed. Andrew's, though, is a much more mature, much more considered, evolved version of Django migrations, and I'm in no way disappointed with what we ended up with.
We should definitely get Andrew here.
Oh, absolutely. Andrew is a wonderful guy, and I heartily recommend him as a speaker.
So, after time contributing to Django, you managed yourself to become the Django Software Foundation president.
Yes.
How did that process look like? What does it take to be the Django Software Foundation president?
So the process for me was mostly is one of those volunteering things of everybody who doesn't want to volunteer, step back. Russel, not so quickly. I ended up being the person who was DSF president at the time because Jacob wanted to step down and no one else really wanted to step forward. And I was very much engaged with the Django community. I was well known to the Django community, so I was a safe and reasonable person to take on that role. That's one of the things that I sort of happened as a result of me becoming DSF president. We did start having a much more rigorous voting process for new presidents coming in and new board members being re-voted in every year and things like that. So the responsibilities are essentially completely divorced from anything to do with the technical side of Django. It's entirely a financial and legal structure. The DSF's role is not to have any architectural influence over what Django is and how it's used in its release process, what code is committed or anything like that. It is purely a legal body that can own the Django trademark, the name of the Django project, the logo, the image work around that, a company, an entity that can own resources like domain names and things like that, a company that can sign contracts on Django's behalf, and an entity that can have a bank account that can take donations and spend those donations in a meaningful way. And so the process of what does the DSF president do? It's mostly all that housekeeping that lets the Django project keep the lights on. So it uses absolutely none of my developer skills to be the DSF president. So in that regard, there are people who have served on the Django board who are not senior developers with 30 years experience developing Django or developing software. They are people who are just very, very well organized, people who know how to run the backside, the back office of companies, or know how to manage communities really, really well. And although the current DSF president, Frank Wiles, is a manager of or an owner of a large Django consulting company. He is also a very talented engineer, but he's also a manager of a company, and so he knows how to keep the books and what a company needs to do to remain legal and keeping in good standing with the US tax office. So yeah, that's basically what the DSF's the DSF president's role and the DSF more generally is about. I certainly spoke a lot more publicly than Frank currently does, but that's in no way required by the role. The DSF's role, there is no technical leadership side, and a lot of the speaking I was doing, yes, I was the DSF president, but I was also a member of the Django core team, and you could argue about which hat I was wearing when I was speaking. Frank he is not a member of the core team. He is the DSF president, And so he doesn't have a technical leadership role in that sense to speak, although he is also a very talented speaker and a very talented technical person, but he's not on the Django core team. So yeah, that's what the DSF does.
And are you still involved in the Django core development team?
So I am still technically on the books. I still do have commit access, but I have not been actively involved in Django development for a couple of years. I'm trying to remember, I think the last time I committed code would have been 3 or 4 years ago at this point. There's any number of reasons for that, one of which is the focus of other projects that I'm now looking at, like the BeeWare project. There is actually also some internal discussion going on at the moment inside Django about dissolving the entire concept of having a core team, about changing the way that we think about the project so that there are people who need to commit code, but that's a set of permissions, not a set of sort of engineering directions. And there's an ongoing debate about how that's going to happen. So it may end up being, I am technically on the core team. I could technically commit code, but I probably wouldn't at this point because I don't have a current understanding of how Django, like what is going on in the current Django ecosystem. I do keep my fingers in touch with the community. I do go to all the Django cons just because I enjoy the people, I enjoy the community, I enjoy the friends that I have made through the Django community. But I'm not actively involved anywhere near as much as I once was.
I really like Django, I really like Django channels, but how do you see Django in the future? Like, are there some big changes coming? Or?
Again, at this point, I am sufficiently abstracted from what is going on in the Django community that I don't know that I would be able to give any good predictions about what will happen in the near future. I think the Django channels is a very important piece of work. I think it needs a lot more time and consideration and resources to be put into it. But I also know that Andrew Godwin, who's behind Django channels, is basically burnt out on it because it's hard work doing it when it needs a lot of engineering focus, and he's basically doing that, well, has done most of the bulk of that work largely on his own. There have been other contributions, but he is the driving force behind that work. That I think is like how Django will deal with real-time and WebSockets and that kind of aspect of things is one of the areas of concern that I have with where Django is going longer term. I think there's also, like, we've seen a lot of movement towards lighter weight frameworks. Sometimes that makes sense, and sometimes I'm not sure necessarily why that's happening, but the web is definitely changing. Like the web that Django evolved into in 2005 is a very different web to the one that we have today. And I certainly have opinions about where I think Python web frameworks, the directions that we need to go, the ways we need to be thinking about the web from a Python perspective. Whether Django 8.0 becomes that ecosystem, or whether something else evolves entirely, I don't necessarily know at this point. I'm certainly interested to find out and see how the world changes.
Now let's talk about the BeeWare project. Could you give us the BeeWare project's elevator pitch to start with?
Sure. So the elevator pitch is that BeeWare is a set of tools and libraries to let you write native applications for your mobile devices and desktop devices in Python. So to be able to take a code base that's 100% Python code and deploy that as a native iOS app, as a native Android app, as a desktop application for macOS, Linux, or Windows, and ideally also as a single-page web app. This is playing into that discussion about where does the future of Django go. Part of that is how do we write an application, write single-page web apps from a Python code base as well. It's a very large project. I have what I would consider at the moment to be a decent proof of concept that it's possible, but there is still a lot of work that needs to be done before it is a 1.0 version product or something that is comparable, like Django comparable in terms of its level of maturity.
And why do you think it's important to have Python like in other ecosystems, like mobile ecosystems? Why Python?
Primarily because I'm looking at the way that our technological ecosystem is evolving. You go back to the era when Python was initially developed, and even up until 10 years ago, a computer was a large box that sat in the back room. The box got smaller and smaller over time, and now it's just a laptop that you throw into your backpack, but it's basically the same computer. It is either Windows or a Unix or Unix derivative that has very, very well-known and well-understood ways of operating. My son started high school last year. He doesn't have a laptop. His school asked him to buy an iPad. That presents an existential problem for Python because you can't run Python on an iPad. You can, you can get Pythonista and other applications which will give you a Python programming environment, but you can't write an iPad application in Python. And if you can't write applications for the devices that are being used, why does the language exist? We then need to work out what is the role of Python in this future. Python is a very adaptable language. It's an easy to learn language. It's a very flexible language. And to my mind, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to build applications in Python, but we don't. Why not? Well, because the tooling's not there. So let's go and provide that tooling. Python is appealing to a wide range of people. It's not just an esoteric computer science language. It's used by mathematicians, it's used by statisticians, it's used by scientists, it's used by astronomers, it's used in education, it's used in embedded devices. It has a very wide appeal because it is a powerful language that is easy to learn and is very expressive. And that's a set of, those people use Python not because they love programming. They use it because they have a problem that they want to solve. They want to get something done, and Python lets them get something done. And sometimes that will mean they need to write an application. So rather than tell them, oh, but you've got to learn this other programming language before you can write that application, let's give them Python. Let's give them a way to use a language that they know, use a language that is approachable and acceptable or is understood by them to do this other thing. And that's the window of opportunity that I see here.
Okay, so with the BeeWare project, you could be in some years known as the guy who kept Python alive. I certainly would like to be thought of that way. That would be a nice little ego boost, but I am mostly pushing the BeeWare project at the moment as one vision of the way the future could be. It doesn't have to be the way that the future is. I am just trying to open the door and say, hey, it could be this. There are other ways of writing mobile applications for using Python. The Kivy project, for example, exists and is out there. Is that the right way? I don't know. I have opinions. BeeWare is an expression of my opinions of the way I think should be done. There are things that would need to be merged back into CPython core, or changes that might need to happen to the Python language as a whole. Which ones of those are going to happen? I don't know. I certainly would like to be involved in that Python future, but if it's not and it just starts the discussion, that's perfectly fine as well. I'd be very happy if that was all it was. Do you know, or do you have any stats of people with the current version of BeeWare, what kind of applications they are building with it?
The short answer is no, and there's sort of an interesting two-part answer to that. One is that it's a very, very young project. It is very, very, version 0.3 is currently in development for the Togo, which is the web toolkit, the user interface toolkit that's being developed. So there are a lot of things that it can't do. And as a result, it's not something that you can sort of say, well, go build your application. There are things it can't do, and it's not as cross-platform as I would like it to be. And so I'm not aware of a lot of people who are using it in anger to actually build applications. That said, every time I turn up at conferences, I get a surprise at people who have announced to me, oh yeah, we were using BeeWare to teach people how to do something. It's like, are you doing what? So there may well be a lot of people who are using BeeWare that I don't know about because they haven't announced somewhere that they've just built this thing with BeeWare, which actually points to a larger problem that we have in the Python ecosystem and in open source in general, is that we don't know who is using our software. We don't know how many people are actually using Django. We don't know what companies are using Django. And that poses an actual serious limitation to the way that we can develop, because we don't know who to approach to ask for donations when it comes to things like fundraising. We can take some guesses because someone makes a big noise about the way that they're using Django or the way they're using Python. But we don't actually know. And there are a lot of people who are using Django that we only find out by accident that they're using Django. They're not required to tell us. Now, there is obviously a privacy concern that's in here, is that you shouldn't have to tell someone that you're using something before they're allowed to use it necessarily. But there is a balance there in that there is a resourcing need that open source projects have. They need to be able to fundraise to pay for the resources that their project is using. Even just basic web hosting takes money, takes resources. But if you don't know who's using your project and who is involved and who's engaged in your community, who do you approach for money? And so this is an ongoing discussion that I think open source projects generally need to have, is how do you balance the privacy concerns of people being able to use your software anonymously, which is a valuable resource in itself, with the genuine need of projects to be able to raise funds and do donation drives around the use of their projects.
So speaking of difficulties, maybe what is the most difficult challenge you're facing right now in BeeWare project with your team to build the tools?
So there's sort of two different types of challenges we're having. One of them is just the basic technical challenge. Things like Android in particular is a problematic, Android and Windows are sort of the two problematic platforms that we have, because Android really wants you to be writing in Java. And they will do, their ecosystem is very Java-centric. And we have been able to get Python into that ecosystem. We've been able to get Python. There are different ways of getting Python to run there. BeeWare uses one. Kiwi uses a slightly different approach at the moment. Or BeeWare might switch to that approach in the future, possibly. But getting over that, the way the platform wants you to do things is a technical challenge. And even just more generally, even if that was not an issue, knowing how Android works is something that you need to know before you can start integrating well with Android. Now, I happen to have a background in doing iOS development by accident of some pieces of my employment history, so I kind of understand how the Mac ecosystem and the iOS ecosystem work. I haven't done Android development before, so I don't have that skill set. And so when, for example, Android pushes out a new version of their developer toolchain and they've made some changes which may have been really well communicated in their own internal channels, but all of a sudden BeeWare's build system breaks, now, I don't know why, because I'm not an Android developer, and I can, juggle around and maybe try to work out what's going on, but it's not a skill set that I have. So one of the big issues that we have is getting people who are both Android experts and know Python to help move the project forward. Or people in the same thing goes in Windows, people who know the Windows ecosystem, know how Windows widgets work and how the Windows APIs work to be able to build the Windows backends for BeeWare. So that kind of building the technical expertise, getting the technical expertise into the project so that we can develop forward. The other, and this is somewhat related, is just a straight up resourcing problem. There is a lot. There are 6 active backends that we're developing for in parallel. That's a lot of balls to keep in the air at the same time. And I am basically doing this all in my volunteer spare time. My day job, it does not use BeeWare in any capacity. All of my BeeWare development time is volunteered time on after hours, on weekends, things like that. And that puts a serious constraint on how much progress you can make. There is a limit to how much progress you can make on a project of this scale if you're only doing it for a couple of hours every weekend. And that is sort of the bigger problem at the moment, is how do we physically resource the amount of work that needs to be done in order to make this an actual viable platform that is version 1.0 that everyone can use. I am on an eternal search for how do you fund and resource speculative development in an open source sense, because it would be very easy for me to close source all of BeeWare, go get VC money for it, and then sell it as a $1,000 a seat cross-platform development toolkit. But that's not what I want to do. I want it to be open source so that I can see BeeWare have the same impact on the world that Django had. But by making that decision, I'm also cutting off a lot of viable revenue streams that would enable me to go and hire the Android expert or the Windows expert to get the job done. So finding that way of resourcing the development, resourcing the work that needs to be done without compromising the open source principles that I hope will make it a successful project is a very, very complex task, and one that's an ongoing struggle.
So speaking of Django in the BeeWare project, you say BeeWare project can generate Django applications, but what does it mean? Like it can generate the actual project in Django that you can then run server and go to the browser?
So the idea that I'm trying to promote with the Django backend for Toga or for BeeWare is that the web is just another application platform. You know, if you sit down and you do a Hello World tutorial for GTK on Linux or macOS, you know, running one of their tutorials for how you write your first application for Mac, you are introduced to a language where you can open a window and you can put a button on the window and you can have a text input on the window. When I press the button, the contents of the text window is used to update a label somewhere on the screen. That is just a set of drawing primitives. You've got a set of basic tools to draw things on the screen that enable you to interact with those things on the screen. And when an event happens, that thing talks to that thing and runs a bit of logic that does another thing. You know, that's basically the same thing the web is doing, except that it does it through slightly different channels. You don't draw pixels on the screen. You don't draw a button on, or you draw a button. You don't draw individual pixels. You're drawing HTML elements which render as pixels. You don't draw a button. You draw an input element that renders as a button. That is a different set of drawing primitives, but it's the same underlying idea. I wish to show to the user an application that has an interface with a button that displays text, and when I press the button, the text input updates that thing over there by running some little piece of logic. Where is that little piece of logic? It might be on the server, it might be in the web browser. That ultimately doesn't matter as far as the application is concerned. It affects how the performance and how it, you know, is deployed to the user. But that's sort of an implementation detail of the high-level idea of what is this user interface? What application am I trying to show to the user? And so the Toga backend, the Django backend for Toga is basically saying, okay, I can describe a Fahrenheit to Celsius converter as an abstract idea. I can turn that into a macOS application. I know what that looks like. I can turn it into a mobile application, and then some of the details will be slightly different, but it will be the same fundamental process. And the same is true of a single-page web app. Part of that puzzle. So what that ends up meaning in terms of Toga is concerned is you say, okay, here is my application that describes I have a window that has a button and a text input and a label, and when I press the button, it takes the input and moves it there, and then converts that into a full Django website that has URLs that you could then publish and do whatever you needed to do. And the little piece of internal logic that's, you know, take the value and multiply it and update the text label is Python code that runs in the browser. Because what we do, we take the server-side definition of the function that's going to execute. We take the bytecode, we transmit that to the web browser, and then we actually ship over a bytecode, a JavaScript implementation of a Python bytecode machine that is able to run the bytecode for the function that's being executed. So you can then have the function that was defined on the server running in the client in exactly the same way. And a lot of what sort of WASM and those sort of technologies in the web is doing is making that process even easier, because we can ship something that is an executable format, not necessarily just JavaScript or native JavaScript. So that's sort of the big picture, is looking at the web not as being this special, unique snowflake of technologies, that is just a way of rendering things to the user. It's a way of rendering user interface elements in a way that the user can then interact with. And it happens to do it in a slightly unusual, document-centric, markup-based way, but ultimately what you're trying to present is the same thing, a user interface.
What's in the future for BeeWare project? Do you have any ultimate goal, like maybe that make you feel done, like you're happy, you've done everything you wanted to do with BeeWare project?
So the practical answer is I don't know, because it's the future, and, you know, the direction, the time that I can dedicate to the project is essentially what's going to dominate its success. What I would consider success, my ideal model, like my sort of visualization of what a successful BeeWare project looks like, is day 2 of a Django Girls tutorial. Day 1, Django Girls, they sit down and they write their blog application, and they get introduced to a bit of programming, they get introduced to Django, they can build a database-backed website that they then deploy somewhere, and they get to see, okay, I can enter blog entries and I can have it appear on the web, and that's fantastic. Look what I've just managed to do. Day 2, they build a mobile application that they can have on their mobile phone. They can start posting blog entries with photographs that they've just taken on their phone that gets posted to the same website. So that is sort of if that ever happened, I would be incredibly happy, because that then means that we have got BeeWare to the point where there are a set of APIs that are mature enough that you can build realistic, real-world mobile applications deployed to iOS, deployed to Android, interacting with features like GPS and photographs on the phone, and that the APIs are mature enough that we can put them in the hands of people that haven't got an intense background of GUI programming and mobile programming, and they can realistically build an application that they can then put on their own phone and say, look, I've built a website, I've built a phone that talks to the website, look at all this stuff that I can do. And then if that is possible, then you can build a startup that has a mobile app that's tied to your database, and the sky's the limit then as far as that's concerned. How long will it take before we get there? I don't know. If some magical genie out there somewhere wants to deliver a large pile of gold to me, I'd be delighted to go and try and make that happen as soon as possible. But I don't know how long it's going to take when I'm volunteering by myself and coordinating other volunteers here and there.
Oh, I just remember you're doing like some kind of fundraising thing for BeeWare project, right?
Yes.
Do you want to tell to our attendees about it?
For sure, yeah. So the BeeWare project, part of what we're trying to do is make this as something that is sustainable, and we don't want this to be a purely people volunteering in their spare time. I'd like to be able to give this the dedicated focus that it needs. And so we do have a membership program. So individuals can sign up and companies can sign up as a member of the BeeWare project and get a little bit of a sort of exposure for their company in the case of companies, or updates as individual contributors. At the moment, I'm internally grateful for every donation that we do get, but it is enough to pay for things like server hosting fees and the CI systems and whatever that we need to keep the project going, and a little bit of extra money to do things like the challenge coins that we handed out, stickers and things like that. It is a long way before I'm going to be able to say, I know I'm giving up my day job and I'm working on BeeWare, but I'd like it to be. So if anybody wants to, they can go to the BeeWare website, beeware.org, and you can join as a member and help contribute.
You've done almost everything one person looks to do in the tech industry, right? You've been like a student, you've been a lecturer, you got a PhD, you've worked for companies, you founded a company and then shut it down, the company, and also the open source stuff and the community stuff. But and a really big etc. right? Is there something you haven't done in your career and that you want to do?
The short version is yes, there is. I'd like to be more successful in some of those things that I've tried. So like you mentioned that I had a startup. Yes, it was a startup. I did run it for about 5 years, but it wasn't successful. We had to shut it down, and there was a big emotional toll to a lot of that work that was going on. I imagine that I might actually return to doing something as a startup at some point in the future. I don't know what that startup will be. I don't know. I haven't got any particular ideas that I'm playing around with at the moment. But I'd like to actually be part of a successful startup. That'd be a nice change. And as a career goal, given that I've got these tech skills, I'd like to see them turn into something that I have made, not entirely my own, but something that's my idea that I have pushed forward. I'd like to be involved with a project. I have been involved with Django as a project and been part of that success story, but that was very much me joining someone else's original idea. I would like to take something that is my original idea and get it to a similar sort of point of success. So whether that's BeeWare, whether that's another startup, I don't know, but that would probably be the one goal that I do have as a sort of a life mission at this point.
Do you have anything left to say to the PyCon Colombia's community?
Keep doing what you're doing. It's amazing what you're doing here. I've really enjoyed the time that I've spent in Bogota and the Colombian people, and your food is amazing. I am I'm amazed to see how much the Python community has grown in the time that I've been involved with it. The number of PyCons that occur around the world is genuinely amazing. PyCon Colombia this weekend is clashing with PyCon Tennessee. Like, we are actually now at the point where every weekend pretty much every weekend, there is more than one PyCon going on. That's huge, and seeing that growth is amazing as well. I'm involved with PyCon Australia as an organizer at the moment, and PyCon Australia, I think this year will be our 10th year. The first year, it was a 150, 200 person conference. This year, it's looking like being a 600, 700 person conference. It takes time to develop those communities and develop those reputations, but the Python community is doing it, and we're seeing it here in Colombia. So keep up the good work is essentially is the underlying message there. These things don't take time to develop. You are doing, by all accounts, all of the right things. Please keep doing them, because it's really great to see these communities build up all around the world, and spreading the message of how Python can be used and how it can be used to improve other people's lives.
Okay, thank you, Russell. I think that's all for now. Thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Colombia.
I absolutely have enjoyed it so far. My only regret is that I can't spend more time here, and I have to get back to Australia and spend far too much time in a metal tube flying across the planet. So thank you very much for having me, and it's been an absolute pleasure.